It's my pleasure to give this talk, which I think is a bit unusual as a talk because it's about fairly recent history, although actually it's about the last century. So my talk is about Tony Rampton OBE, Petersham's pioneering philanthropist. I first met Anthony, as has been mentioned, when I got a job in Brixton because he was on the interview panel and I was just starting out my career in 1970. We lost contact when I changed jobs, but 20 years later, I had the good fortune in Petersham to bump into him and his wife Joan, and I was able to pick up again on this fascinating story. Anthony was a successful businessman, a devoted husband and father, and also an innovative philanthropist and thinker. Furthermore, as you will see, he was a gifted artist, and this lovely painting of him with his hobby of fishing shows him, I think, to good advantage. Quite a lot of his paintings were of local scenes, so you'll have the pleasure of seeing many more of his paintings throughout the talk. Tony died on the 30th of September 1993, and he's buried alongside his wife, who died in 2008, and their graves are in the churchyard of St. Peter's Church in Petersham, which is also the subject of quite a lot of his paintings. Over some 40 years, Tony produced some 350 paintings, but he never exhibited his work. He painted entirely for himself during his spare time and was largely self-taught. After his death, an exhibition of his paintings was mounted in 1997 in Orleans House Gallery. Orleans House was the subject of a fascinating talk to the Society in January. The exhibition was opened by Tony's great friend and fellow charitable entrepreneur, Lord Young of Dartington. Have you heard of him? I find a lot of people have, and yet you should have, because Lord Young of Dartington was the founder of the Open University and also the consumer organisation Which, and also actually quite a lot of other organisations. So he was a very remarkable man as well, but that's a different talk. I will show you more of Tony's paintings later on, but let's get started with his origins. He was a local lad born in Kingston upon Thames and went to Harrow School, where apparently his claim to fame was that he could throw a cricket ball further than any other pupil before or since. Of course, I don't know when the since dated from, so whether any pupil has excelled further, I don't know. He was clearly physically strong, as you will learn from a story when he was courting his wife-to-be. He went on to Queen's College, Oxford, where he read law. According to his son Richard, while at Oxford, he fell in with a brainy lefties. It's likely that he wanted to pursue a career in law, but it was not to be. Instead, he joined the family firm, which used to be a household name. So what was the family firm? Well, a year after it was founded, apologies, I think I've missed something. Yes, the family firm was Freeman's and Company, which was founded in 1905 by 4 partners. 2 were Ramptons, a Jones and a Freeman. It began life with only 12 staff out of a terraced house based in Clapham, South London. Each member put up £100 as capital to get the business going. Doesn't sound like a lot, but then it was the equivalent of over £10,000. A year after it was founded, it moved to larger premises at 215 Lavender Hill, Wandsworth. The company staff affectionately nicknamed it Lavender Hill Mob. Now, I'm not sure if this picture is correct. I rather suspect this is a more modern substitution for the same address. But they named it the Lavender Hill Mob 45 years before the famous British film of the same name was made. In 1914, the company was forced to direct its efforts towards a war effort, having been a general store, really, of clothing and goods and so on. So it had to focus on blankets and selling them to the government and the armed forces. After the First World War, new levels of disposable income as part of a post-war boom led to an increasing levels of consumerism, and Freeman capitalised on this by producing a fully colorised 1,000-page catalogue that was distributed by mail and featured a much wider range of products. The credit proposition was also giving Freeman a USP, a unique selling point, that wasn't available on the high street, and was also perhaps the primary reason that catalogue shops such as Grattan's and Littlewoods and Empire stores also did so well in that period. But Freeman's grew to dominate the mail order landscape in the 1930s, being the largest mail order company in the UK with over 30,000 agents. Expansion also meant that the company needed to find larger premises, and it moved to 139 Clapham Road, London in 1937, an iconic building which is still featured on themed tours of London as one of the top industry-related places to visit in London. So this is a company which Tony joined in 1938. Freeman specialised in selling clothing items and distributed its catalogue each month throughout the UK. The initial catalogues were made up of black and white illustrations that reflected the available products. I'm afraid I couldn't find any pictures from the catalogues at the time that Tony joined, but here are some from 1955, showing the men's suits and some of the women's dresses. Of the product range, the made-to-measure suits were a particular success, offering a cheap, tailored opportunity for customers at the time, costing only 30 shillings, but that's equivalent to about £165 now. The company used agency representatives in local areas as a form of credit control and to manage sales, with most goods being sold on credit. However, women at that time were restricted by law as they couldn't negotiate credit arrangements, and they required the husband's signature to purchase goods. Therefore, the majority of agents were men. Also in 1938, he fell for a Scottish young lady called Joan Shanks, whom he met at a wedding. She holidayed in Iran at the time and was apparently much sought after. There were 5 other young men trying to win her favour. I have 2 lovely stories told to me by Tony's children about how he managed to overcome the competition. On one occasion, they were in Arran, near the famous Cat Rock. To impress Joan, the other youngsters tried to jump up to the top of the cat stone, the one in this picture. The youngsters had on rubber-soled shoes, which should have helped them, but they failed to surmount it. However, Tony was wearing brogues with slippery leather soles, which would have put him at quite a disadvantage. Nonetheless, he leapt at the stone and succeeded in getting to the top in 2 leaps. Apparently, he was very strong, which may have had a link to his prowess at throwing the cricket ball at school. His second stunt was a mixture of cerebral ability and cunning. At that time, The Guardian, then the Manchester Guardian, would contain a cryptic crossword, which would be published the following day in the Glasgow Herald. Tony did the crossword while travelling up on the train up to Scotland the day before meeting with Joan. When he got there, he found these same youths were there, and they were struggling with the cryptic crossword in the Glasgow Herald. So he said, "Give it to me," and promptly solved it straight off, not admitting that he had already worked on it on the train coming up to Scotland the day before. How much these competitive successes featured in his winning his bride, I don't know, but in November 1939, they married. Joan was from the Shanks family, who made lavatories. A few nice pics of them here. Tony was, as I said, working for Freeman's, a family firm, which he joined after university in 1938 at the age of 23. And he married Joan. And then came the war, and Tony volunteered for the army. You can see him here in his army uniform. He joined the Royal Berkshires and was in India from 1944 to 1946, where he performed the remarkable feat of taking a convoy all the way across the country, probably more than 1,000 miles. After the war, he returned to Britain as a major and rejoined the family firm. This was not the kind of thing that Oxford-educated young men did in those days, and apparently he needed some forceful persuading. According to an obituary in the Independent, he would, like his son Richard, have made an excellent barrister, but that was not to be. Tony and Joan had their first son Richard in 1941. They moved to Gort Lodge in Petersham shortly after the war, and they had 3 more children, David in 46, Lizzie in 48, and Ben in 53. And these are some of Tony's paintings of the children. So what got them started in philanthropy? With a growing family of their own, the first philanthropic activity of which I am aware, in which Joan and Tony took a leading part, was the establishment in the late 1940s of the Standing Conference of Registered Adoption Societies. At the time, there were no laws about adoption. Jane Roe, the chief executive of what would become the British Agencies for Adoption and Fostering, where my husband Robert once worked, wrote in her obituary of Tony that in 1957 she attended a conference organised by him. She says, "I can see his bald head with its fringe of hair curling over his coat collar, though that was far from fashionable at the time. He came onto the platform for the annual general meeting, walking decorously behind the committee members, touching a large minute book. I realise now that it was typical of Tony's self-effacing ways that he would slip in last, and also typical that he'd be carrying a minute book and ensure that everything was done properly and in order. If it had not been for Tony and his wife Joan, I doubt that the disparate group of voluntary adoption societies that came together at the end of the 40s to try and form a standing conference would ever have got it off the ground. This would have been sad because it was urgently needed. The adoption scene was totally different from the one we know today. Literally thousands of babies were being placed every year by about 70 adoption agencies of widely differing sizes and standards. Jane Roe also commented that Tony became immensely knowledgeable, but never saw himself as an expert, and as far as I know, he never wrote or spoke in public about the subject. He saw his role as enabling professional adoption workers to do a better job, but he never interfered in their work. It was a great strength that he had no personal axe to grind, being neither an adoptive parent, nor an unmarried father, nor an adopted child. He did have a deep concern for the welfare of children, especially those who were in any way disadvantaged. I can see him now saying in anguished tone after a long discussion about some complex problem in one of the adoption agencies, "Yes, but what about the children?" He was a marvellous person to work for, with the most amazing ability to delegate and trust his staff. He managed to keep fully aware of what was going on without fussing or asking a lot of questions. Yet he was always keen to be involved, open to ideas, and willing to support new initiatives with sound advice and often with financial backing too. Adoption law was sketchy at that time and paid more regard to the rights of adults than to the needs of children. So there was an enormous need to increase knowledge, raise standards, and bring order to the situation so that children and parents would be better protected. It was Tony's skill and foresight and efficiency which enabled the Standing Conference to grow into a highly respected organisation that has influenced government departments and legislation that has a profound and beneficial effect on the development of adoption and fostering services in Britain. Jane Roe, who I've mentioned, was the Standing Conference's first paid member of staff, said that for the 16 years before she came on board, Tony and Joan had done everything. They dealt with subscriptions, they sent out thousands of journals and leaflets and organised conferences and answered innumerable letters and queries from member agencies and the general public. Tony had been pioneering in leading the way for this organisation to be set up. But he had great sticking power too. Tony's interest in adoption continued unflagging for 4 decades. Not many people can say that. So what was the impact? Well, there were 2 acts of Parliament, the Adoption Act of 58 and the Children Act of 75, and both were credited as a direct result of his work, and he was appointed to the Order of the British Empire in 1965 in recognition of this work. This description of how Tony and Joan started this important charity is, I think, a great example of pioneering philanthropy through social action. Getting in there and making it happen, getting this big idea off the ground, but also doing the long, hard slog of keeping the organisation moving until it had proved its value and was able to attract funding and enable paid professional staff to be appointed. Lord Young of Dartington, who I mentioned earlier as being a good friend of Tony and putting on the exhibition for him, operated in a similar way, getting new social action initiatives off the ground. They were both real social entrepreneurs. Clearly, Tony was financially comfortable as a director of Freeman's. But how did he become rich? In 1963, Freeman's was floated on the stock market and became a public limited company. For Tony, it came as a big shock to suddenly find that he was rich. Apparently, the shares fetched unexpectedly high prices. This was reported in the local Richmond Herald. 4.8 million shares were offered for sale at 33 shillings. And then on Monday, the stock exchange opened and the shares at 33 shillings and 3 pence. Shortly afterwards, 7 descendants of the founders, including Mr. Anthony Rampton, had become millionaires, or something like that. Mrs. Anthony Rampton denied that she personally was one of the new millionaires. "I've never held a share in my life," she said. Freeman's, under Tony's direction, was pretty innovative. It installed its very first computer, being the first mail order company to do so. This was just one example of how Freeman's built a name as the most pioneering mail order company in the UK, followed by the introduction of telephone ordering and even digital catalogues. Tony rose through the ranks of the company and was chairman for 19 years, and he was then accorded the accolade of being appointed president, the first and only president the company has ever had. Integrity, high standards, broad-mindedness, far-sightedness characterised his business attitude, and he expected the same of others. Nobody should take advantage of a customer, supplier, or even a competitor. He would not compromise his own conscience, nor expect anyone else to do so in the supposed interest of the company. Freeman's had to be an honourable company in all of its dealings. A fun anecdote from one of his colleagues was, one of my happiest memories was when we both played cricket for Freeman's, watching Tony terrify the opposition with his demon bowling, once again determined that Freeman's would be on top. Another colleague gave this story. Crack. The chair back noisily gave up its struggle. Tony, who had spent the last half hour in my office rocking back and forth on what had seemed to be a solid built chair, raised his eyebrows and said, "Ralph, you really should get some better furniture. Someone could have had a bad accident on that one day." It was always a surprise to Tony that inanimate objects collapsed under his touch. Most of us were well used to him entering a room with the door handle still in his hand. Once an item was described in the catalogue as virtually indestructible. Tony found the challenge too good to pass up. He tested it and eventually gave the pieces to the buyer within 24 hours. Ralph continued. Tony was president of the European Mail Order Traders Association from 73 to 76. At the time, we had a lot of disputes with Brussels authorities. That sounds familiar. Tony authorised me to attack our opponents if necessary. And when I went too far, he intervened with his calm, distinct voice to make peace. And this succeeded very often. It was quite a unique method. Tony cared deeply for people. In a rare, if not unprecedented act of generosity, he expressed his deep concern by establishing the Freeman's Trust in 1974 with 250,000 of his own Freeman's shares, with the object of helping staff, retired staff and their dependents in times of need. When Freeman's and Grattan merged in 2001, the trustees immediately decided that this was the appropriate time to change the name to Tony Rampton Trust to honour the founder. So, how did I get to know Tony? Well, I met Tony in 1975 when I became a community relations officer at a charity called the Council for Community Relations in Lambeth. We were based in Brixton, which was the heart of the West Indian and Jamaican community and often referred to as the front line. Tony was an active trustee of the charity and was on the panel when I was interviewed for the job. When I got to know him, I asked him how he came to be involved with charitable work, and he told me the following story. Not only was it a shock for him to find himself rich when his company was floated on the stock exchange, but he found that his family were becoming famous because of this. This was not a fame that I think he welcomed. Even more, he was concerned that when his children were being feted at school for suddenly becoming rich, that this could be a big problem. So he consulted a good friend, a solicitor for a lot of gentry, and asked him what happened in his experience to the children of rich parents. He said that in his experience, 90% go bad. Apparently, he viewed wealth as a curse. So what to do about this new wealth? Tony decided to give a considerable portion of his newly acquired wealth to charity. With the active support of his wife, Joan, Tony set up the Hildon charity in 1963. They chose a name which would not identify who the donor was, a real example of Tony and Joan's modesty. Through the Hildon Charitable Trust, they gave financial assistance to many Brixton charities, especially those concerned with race relations and the welfare of what were then referred to as West Indians. His hope was that his children would no longer be so wealthy, and they would have a better chance of not going bad. I was intrigued by this. At the time, Tony and Joan's children were young adults, and I was very curious to know how they turned out in the long run, whether they were happy with the strategy their father had implemented, whether it had worked well for them as a family. But I lost contact with Tony when I left the Community Relations Council, and I imagined I would never hear how this story turned out. In addition to his charitable work through Hildon Trust, Tony Rampton was directly involved in a number of worthwhile causes, including local church and youth clubs in South London. He was closely connected with the Lambeth Community Trust and its work for the homeless, and was active in the Lambeth Community Relations Council, where he was a source of much sound advice to many an activist, and supported the West Indian Ex-Servicemen's Association. Despite some resistance, he made sure that his own firm employed a large number of black people. That was at a time when there was considerable prejudice against black people. I remember signs which would say, "No dogs and no black people." He helped set up Runnymede Trust, a forum for research into race relations, and for nearly 2 decades gave it general financial assistance. In 1979, he was appointed as chairman of a committee of inquiry into the education of children from ethnic minority groups, set up by the Secretary of State for Education, Shirley Williams, who sadly died recently. It was her last act before Jim Callaghan's Labour government fell and lost the election to Margaret Thatcher. This was an extremely difficult and delicate assignment, especially as there was no educational consensus as to why Afro-Caribbean children performed so badly in public examinations. Tony Rampton wisely guided the deliberations of the committee, made sure that it stayed clear of superficial explanations and political polemics, and held together a multiracial body with strong views and passions. The interim report of the committee blamed, among other things, low teacher expectations and the racial prejudices of both white teachers and society at large. It required considerable courage at the time to say this simple truth. Not surprisingly, the media tried to discredit the report, even before its publication, and the Minister in charge of Education sacked Tony Rampton. He was deeply pained, not so much by the sacking as by the way the inconvenient truths were suppressed, but was never bitter and even urged some of his committee colleagues to stay on in the larger interest of the community. Lord Swan, who succeeded Tony Rampton as chairman, produced a report in 1984, which broadly repeated its conclusions, and they are now part of conventional wisdom. According to Bhikkhu Parekh, a political theorist and Labour lord, Tony received no official recognition for his work, but he did earn the abiding gratitude of millions of ordinary black and white men and women, and a large number of educationalists. The director of the Runnymede Trust said, in tribute to Tony after his death, "We are convinced from the evidence we have obtained that racism, both intentional and unintentional, has a direct and important bearing on the performance of West Indian children in our schools." This sentence in the interim report of the Committee into the Education of Children from Ethnic Minority Groups was at the time one of the most significant statements ever made in official government report. The report went on to speak of negative and patronising attitudes to black children and their families and communities amongst teachers and educational administrators, and widespread low expectations of their academic performance. Francis Crook, director of the Howard League for Penal Reform, wrote, "His generous support for the Howard League spanned many decades and responded to special funding needs, as for example, when 4 young men took their own lives in Feltham Prison. Tony supported us to act quickly and set up an inquiry." As you can imagine, from the number of suitors you heard about previously, Joan Rampton was also a fantastic person. So I thought I must say a little about her. She was equally as active as Tony in setting up and running the Standing Conference of Registered Adoption Societies, in putting their money into charitable trusts and in keeping their name out of it, and of being a trustee for the first 30 years with Tony, and then for a further 15 after his death. Joan worked as a voluntary social worker for Barnardo's in the 1950s. She and Tony ran a youth club in a tough area. And here is a fascinating insight into a local institution, which I think will interest you. It's from a letter that she wrote to Bishop Trevor Huddleston, about which you'll hear more later. She wrote this in 1967. She said, "I am working 2 mornings a week at the Star and Garter home now. At first I thought my heart would break, as most of the men I tend only have the use of their heads, as it were, and many cannot even talk very well, even although their minds are 100%. Most of them have spinal injuries and muscular dystrophy, etc. But now I find it absolutely inspiring, for the men's acceptance of their fantastically limited, in every sense, lives is more courageous than anything I've ever seen in my life. And somehow, because they've only got their heads left to them, they make so much better use of it than most normal men do. I think they are the salt of the earth. And since I've been here 2 months now, I've only heard one of them complain. There are about 40 in our ward, and one has been on his back since 1916. He's 84 now. Tony and Joan were great friends of Bishop Trevor Huddleston, and I believe they met Trevor because they wanted to find out who was behind the trust which had donated funds to one of his causes. This painting by Tony of Bishop Trevor is, I think, rather fine. I would love to see it in colour. At the moment, I only have the black and white. They supported many of Trevor's initiatives, especially his work in the Masai in Tanzania. They visited him there and took a great interest in setting up of a nursing school. This is from one of their letters, written on the 7th of January 1968 by Joan. We get endless pleasure in looking at the pictures. We are really transported back to Masai. As each month passes, I hanker more and more to return to Africa. We're delighted that the opening of the nursing school was such a success, and it is excellent that children's ward building has begun and that a 10-bedded leprosy ward is planned. By the way, there is one thing I must say or stress strongly, and that is that you must stop thanking us, for it is we who are in your debt. Ours is a completely passive role, the only impassive bit having been our great trip to Masai, which was all joy. It's entirely due to your being in Africa and to your inspiration and planning and constant work that we have learned what is needed. And in this way, we are able to be what I think are so deeply privileged people who are able to do something useful in a country where it is really needed at the moment. In exactly the same way, those who are lucky enough to be able to provide money for a serious education should not be thanked, for theirs is a privileged and passive role. A few months later, in a letter dated May 1968, Trevor wrote to Tony, "I know you'll forgive me for making a special and urgent request. Do you think you could procure some football jerseys of one colour for a teenage team? I went to Dar es Salaam and I found that the jerseys were all too big. I would like to get them before I depart in July." Well, it wasn't July. By 22nd of May, Trevor was able to write and thank them for the receipt of the football shirts and shorts and socks. His request had been more than fulfilled, and amazingly speedily. This is an excellent painting of some of the trustees at work, evaluating grant applications and deciding who to fund. These are of Joan and two of their sons, plus a son-in-law. I think this is a rather lovely painting, and if you ever go to the Hilden Trust offices, you'll see it has pride of place in the Hilden Trust boardroom. This is also a picture that I love, and I'm sure you recognise its location. But how did Tony get into doing painting? Well, according to the artist Ian Simpson, who wrote on the exhibition of Tony's paintings after his death, the gift of a camera in 1961 provided Tony with a new interest. He took many black and white photographs and converted an upstairs room into a dark room for processing films. After 2 years, however, his enthusiasm began to wane, not least because colour photography was becoming widely available, and that was very difficult to process at home. He mentioned his dilemma to the friend who had actually given him the camera, and she gave him a mahogany box of oil paints and a sketching easel. Tony began another life as a painter. Blissfully unaware of the pitfalls, he started by painting people and portraits. Without perhaps realising it, Tony planned for himself a serious course in painting. He read about the theoretical aspects and studied the work of other artists. Tony even attended an art class, but he left totally disillusioned after one term of drawing plaster casts in pencil, which he found deadly boring. This picture shows a beautifully peaceful Petersham. This is a memory from a friend of theirs, Marianne Duncan, at Tony's memorial. She says, "In those early days, in the late 40s, Petersham was a quiet place with fewer distractions. The occasional car drove along the main road, and our children could cross the road in peace, cycle along the lanes, and walk by themselves all over Petersham and the park. There was also in those days a village shop, and somebody lit the gas lamps at dusk. It was a good time and a good place for friendships." Sounds like something we might want to go back and visit. This is some rather nice paintings of Petersham. And here we have some of the many lovely paintings that Tony did of St. Peter's Church in Petersham. And as I said, that is now where Tony and Joan are buried. So you might recognise this picture because at the moment it's the background to my Zoom presentation. And here we have some Thames landscapes, pictures of Isleworth. And I think he must have had a Cubist period, because these are his Cubist paintings. He also did paintings of Isidore Kaplan's house on Richmond Hill. Isidore Kaplan was a great friend of Tony and Joan and was also involved with their charitable work. This gives me a chance to do a plug for the 2020 Journal of the Richmond Local History Society, as it has an excellent article by Ron Berryman on Isidore and his Richmond Hill committee. So, how did the Ramptons' plans to help their children and their family life turn out? Did it turn out well by them not having been too wealthy? My husband Robert Smith and I moved with our young children to Kew in 1993. Shortly afterwards, we were walking in Petersham, and I noticed Tony in his house. We made contact and were warmly welcomed by Tony and his wife Joan for tea and a chat at Court Lodge, where they lived. It was great to catch up on old times. I also had a chance to see many of his wonderful paintings. I was able to ask Tony and Joan how things had worked out for his family. Had giving so much of his wealth away to charity been viewed positively by his children? Had they turned out the way he hoped? Well, we're delighted to say that all had gone well. Each of their children had succeeded in their careers and had settled down with their partners, built strong families, and they were involved themselves with the Hildon charity as trustees, helping to decide on charitable applications. And here are two of the Rampton children with Joan and some spouses and some grandchildren outside the Hildon office. Here we have a picture of a trustee meeting and Joan putting up a picture of Tony fishing. So you might ask, how much actually has the Hildon Trust given to charity over the years? So the Hildon Charitable Fund has spent over £30 million in the last 60 years on around 4,000 projects. The importance of the funds to Black and minority ethnic groups in the 60s and 70s was immense. They were always keen on core funding, which was unpopular to most people then, and it's still not popular today. If you read the most recent Association of Charitable Foundations report, they will tell you that they wish they had more charities that would do that. So there was plenty to talk about. In spite of a stroke late in life, Tony Rampton enjoyed pretty good health. But a few months after we had moved to the area and I had remade contact with him, he was rushed to hospital with breathing difficulties. A day before his death, he became very ill, and he asked Joan if the end was near. When she said yes, he asked his doctor son, David, to take him through what was likely to happen, what he was likely to experience. He accepted the news of impending death with enormous dignity and courage, and spoke separately to each of his 4 children and his grandchildren, and telling Joan how lucky they had been to have led such fulfilling lives. His son Richard told me that he and his siblings were there at his bedside in the Brompton Hospital. Apparently, Tony mentioned the Empire Windrush, whose passengers he had been so concerned about for much of his life. Also notably, he said, just before he died, "Golly, that's a Swiss. I can only see one angel." When Tony died in 1993, there were so many tributes to him. I've already quoted from a number in pulling this piece together, but I want to finish with these 2. Cal Younger, who was the founder of the Ex-Prisoners of War Association, said at Tony's memorial service in 1994, "I cannot recall my first meeting with Tony. I simply became conscious of his presence at a meeting about race relations or penal reform or drug addiction. As time went on, I became more and more aware of an original mind, a shrewd sense of humour and infinite compassion. You find these traits in his paintings, his choice of subjects at unexpected angles or use of daring colours. It was the same with his writing. His introduction to the 1981 Directory of Grant-Making Trusts entitled Choice, The Anxieties of Trustees, was years ahead of its time and is still cited with some admiration. Throughout its 30-year history, he has illustrated problems so that others too have seen them. No one person has contributed more to race relations in this country than Tony. At a trustee meeting, deliciously chaotic meetings with 3 generations of the family present, I was touched by Tony's humility. When Joan died, this was a tribute in the Association of Charitable Foundations magazine in 2008. Despite the passing of time, I still meet many people who remember Tony and Joan's kindness and who speak with affection about the couple who not only cared, but also seemed to understand what voluntary projects might achieve. One could list so many achievements under Tony and Joan's stewardship, but notable was their pioneering funding of Black groups in the 60s and 70s, then a radical and at times risky endeavour. I know that Joan took pride in Hilden being one of the first funders of the campaign against racial discrimination in 1967. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been my pleasure to give you a tribute to Tony and to Joan. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Judy, for that fascinating talk about an inspirational figure. I think for most of us, we know so little about this great man, local resident down in Petersham, and his extraordinary diverse interests, pioneering philanthropy and skills as a painter, and his diverse social initiatives. So thank you indeed for